I'd like to introduce Lindsey Strickler and John McGovern.
Good morning. So I'm a little schemer. My business partner often looks at me going, what is she going to do when I get this face on? And I have a question for you guys. How many of you are doing God's work? Raise your hand. How many of you are followers of Jesus? Raise your hand. For both of those questions, every hand in this room should be raised, because everything that we do is God's work. When my family moved back to the US, my parents were going, okay, where do we send our daughter to high school? And they started looking at Christian schools. And I'm 14, I'm standing there and I'm like, this isn't right. And I look at my parents and I go, you guys have taught me to be the salt and the light of the world. So why are you gonna send me to a Christian school where I will only be around Christians and I won't be around non-believers? So my parents looked at me and they're like, we can't argue with that. And so I went to a public school. And for as long as I can remember, my life and my passion has been with unchurched men and women who crave an encounter with hope, but they don't know what that hope is. And if you had asked anyone what I would become when I grew up, they would have told you an artist or a missionary, because that's where my heart was. That's where my heart was oriented, was to the creative and to my Creator. And as I went to college, I went to a Christian school. I worked in parachurch ministry. I worked with high schoolers. I worked with college students. And I was doing God's work. And I thought, okay, well, I'm a Christian, and the highest calling of a Christian is to do God's work and to share the gospel, and shouldn't I be happy working in ministry? Isn't this where I should be? And I wrestled with this because while I was good at what I did, I was never fully satisfied when I walked in to the organizations where I was working throughout college. And thankfully, I went to this incredible college whose entire curriculum is built on how do we create extraordinary people willing to serve in ordinary circumstances. And they taught me that if I was gonna live out my calling of being a believer, my salvation, my redemption, it didn't have to be in the context of the church. It could be anywhere I went, anywhere I go, I'm a missionary. Anywhere I go, I'm serving my God. Anytime I walk into a room, the people that are there, that's my mission field. And so this wrestling continued, and in my senior year, I'm being recruited by ministries to come work for them. And I've applied to seminary, and through a series of profound voices in my life and some books that I read, I realized ministry is not where I should go. I'm graduating with a degree in fine arts. I have ministry jobs. I'm not gonna do this. Okay, God, where do I go? What do I do? And I found myself a year later getting my MBA. And God showed me through these different people in my life and different books that I read that business could be a tool used to transform communities. And I found a fire ignite inside of me, and I was like, I wanna explore this. I wanna go see what's here. And so my purpose in going to get my master's in business was not because I wanted to make a lot of money, but it's because I wanted to see how can this tool be used by God. And I wanted to learn everything I can about this tool. And while I was there, I worked in microfinance, and I saw how business was being used to work with low-income men and women here in the US to raise them to a place of self-sufficiency. And I still had this wrestling going, okay, God, I love the work that we're doing, but I'm so young and I'm so green, and I need to learn from good businessmen and women how to run a good business. If I'm gonna be effective at what I do, which is starting businesses and meeting people where they're at, I need to know more about this. And I ended up graduating with my MBA. I left my microfinance job, and I've been self-employed ever since. And through this journey, God has brought incredible voices into my life, older voices, to help me understand how I should run a good business. And in my journey, I've seen how we're all crying out for purpose. My generation is crying out for purpose. Older generations are crying out for purpose. and purpose in business. What are we creating? How do we use what we're creating to make a difference in the world?
So my story is fairly similar to Lindsey's. I grew up in a Christian home. And from that, I watched my parents combine business with church, kind of breaking the barrier between the secular and the sacred. I like math. That's kind of where I lean towards. So I went to school. I did architectural engineering because I wanted to solve problems. I wanted to solve meaningful problems. And in that, I found another group of people that also wanted to solve problems. And the more I've been able to interact with my generation, the more I see that is more so blanketed across all of us. We all want to work, but we all want to solve meaningful problems. And I see that also true in the baby boomers generation, the generation that goes before us. So in the audience, I see a lot of baby boomers. And I know that there's a lot of millennials that stand behind us, and their stories are very similar to ours. We are the faces that you see in your church. We are those millennials that you see kind of hanging in the back. Maybe they don't say something, maybe they do get engaged. But deep in their heart is the desire to make meaningful change and to solve meaningful problems. So when we were starting to prepare for this talk, we were identifying the separation, that there's a line between the secular and the sacred right now. And in the millennial generation, we don't really feel that. We see that line being separated. And we also identified that there's a line between the generations in the church. And so to me, that made sense in a simple statement, that we have wealth, we have wisdom, and then we have those of us that are wet behind the ears. And there's kind of a shift between where that wealth and where that wisdom lives, and where those of us that are young guns, we don't really know what the mistakes look like yet. We don't know the full cost, but because of that, we're not afraid to jump out and take big risks. So after I graduated from college, the construction industry was less than strong, we'll just say that. So the story of millennials going and living in their parents' basement, very true. It was an upstairs room, but close enough. But from that, I got a very good perspective of, I don't really have much to lose. So when you look at the faces of the millennials that are in your church, that are living with their parents or trying to get by, we have an opportunity to look at that as, okay, we've either failed or we've done something wrong, or we can look at the potential that's there and knowing that we have an entire people group, an entire generation with very little to lose. And we also have a very strong generation that's gone before us that has that wisdom of having walked the path before. You guys know, as baby boomers, some of the potholes that we should really avoid. And you also have the wealth of having walked your path, being able to save, being able to have the resources to put behind those good ideas that we know will make meaningful change. And so we wanted to identify that shift and that coming together that we want to be able to address.
Yeah, it's funny. Like John said, this separation between the sacred and the secular, it's almost a weird conversation for millennials. We're so connected, we're so technology driven that there's really not a whole lot of compartmentalization in our lives. Everything overlaps and overflows, and so this idea that like, oh, I have my church life and I have my work life or my business life, or if you really love God, you do ministry, and I mean, if it's just not your thing, you do something else. Like, it's just not even an option. That's a strange concept for us because everything we do overflows and overlaps. And so there's this tension because we're going, there shouldn't be a line in between these items. And that tension is a word that every time we sat down and talked and going, okay, like, what is it that's going on in the world of millennials? Tension kept coming up in my mind. And it's tension with other generations, it's tension with ourselves, it's tension with the world around us. In our generation, we had events like 9/11, where we realized maybe in America we're not quite so invincible as we thought. We had the recession, which broke formulas in how we're supposed to live our lives and how we're supposed to run our careers. We have access to overwhelming amounts of information about the world, and we realize this world has fallen and broken, and we're inundated with these messages each and every day. We have a church that's struggling to understand its place in our society. And so as millennials, we're standing there going, okay, what do I do with this? Where do I go with this? And when they're asked, 84% of millennials would rather make $40,000 a year doing something with purpose than make $100,000 a year just for the sake of it. And when asked, 64% said they crave their employers to be doing something that makes a difference as a part of the work that they do. And so with this heart and where we're at, we're just crying out, going, okay, how do we reconcile the brokenness in our world? We don't trust the church. Millennials just don't trust the church, but they crave the message of hope and life that it has to offer. And there's this cry of church be the church. Please, church be the church. And it's a judgment that we've had on older generations that I don't think we fully understand and we can't fully explain. And it's created some of divisiveness that is unintended. Because I don't think that cry is church be the church. I think it's actually Christian be a Christian. The church is made up of individuals, and if we don't take individual responsibility, then an institution can never change. And so what they're really asking is, Christian, how are you making business decisions? Christian, how is what you're doing impacting your customers? Christian, how is what you're doing affecting the world around you and the environment around you? If you talk to millennials, they love talking about stories. And they're going, oh, what's the story here? What's this brand story? And Donald Miller talks about how we just want to live a better story. We just want an opportunity to live a better story, and we don't want to leave the world in a worse place than how we found it. And through our passion and our fervor to find hope and to bring hope and to solve problems, we've created chaos. There's certain one-for-one models that we can all think about that have created damaging effects on communities. And our heart wasn't to create damage. Our heart was going, how do we use what we've been given to make a difference? How can we use business to make a difference? And there's this deep-rooted desire to just be change makers, but we can't do that alone. And in the conversations between older generations and younger generations, there's an opportunity for you guys to speak into us, to speak into our passion. We need your wisdom. We need your guidance. Yes, we sometimes speak different languages, but we just want to live a better story, and we need you to do that, help us do that. This demand for a better story has translated into our purchase decisions and into the things that we do. The amount of brands and companies that are coming out with social responsibility as part of their messaging is drastically growing. And it's because millennials who have $1 trillion in purchasing power are saying, hey, you guys better make a difference. You guys have hurt our world. Why don't we use that power for good? And in a local context, it's exciting to see how that has translated into passionate millennials using business to create an impact on their community. But they haven't been able to do this alone. They've had to have older generations speaking into how do we create models? How do we do hiring? How do we manage money? And in Denver, we have businesses that are hiring youth, homeless youth, and giving them job skills. There's a coffee shop called Purple Door, and they partner with these youth to give them the skills that they didn't have parents to teach them. And they're a for-profit business, but they partner with nonprofits for housing, for food, for these other things that these kids need. And after going through this program, which has a 60% graduation rate, these students are then able to go and work in a coffee shop, which there's one on every corner in Denver, and they're able to pay their own rent. They're able to buy their own food. This is a for-profit business making a change in the lives of a vulnerable population. There's others like Naughty Thai that are hiring refugees to make their product. And they have gained so much attraction. They had like Hillary Clinton in their offices earlier this year. Because what they're doing is they're going, how do we use this model of for-profit business to create a sustainable solution to address a vulnerable population in our community? There's others like Mile High Workshop, Women's Bean Project, that are going, again, the question is, how do we use business as a tool to transform communities? How do we use business to give jobs to the formerly incarcerated, to men and women who have struggled with addictions and are now trying to get back on their feet? How do we serve these vulnerable populations? And it's amazing. And even in Kansas City, you have businesses doing the same thing. And these models can be profit donation. They can be product donation. They can be supply chain assessment. Where are you sourcing your materials? How are you treating the people in that process? Or it can be employment. And so we're asking these questions around how do we use the knowledge that we have to create impact?
So the impact that we want to address and what we're trying to bring to the forefront really comes down to life cycles. We all have that question of what does it mean to impact a life? Like how do we know that we're impacting our community? And we believe that we can boil that down to life cycles. So Purple Door is a great example of a company that's changing the life cycles of their community. They are taking people that are living on the street and partnering with them through the arduous process of getting a job. I didn't know this before talking to them, but many of our homeless aren't able to get a job because they don't have birth certificates. They were born on the streets. They were born without the information that we take for granted that allows us to go into a place of work and acquire a job. So when we talk about life cycles, there's a few things that really get impacted and that shape a life. Where do people get their food? Where do they get their clothing? How are they clothed? And where does their shelter come from? And for most of us, those things are foregone conclusions. We know how to provide that for ourselves. But for a lot of our communities, those questions aren't answered and they were never taught how to get that. So when we look at businesses that make an impact here in our own communities, and we say, church be the church, what does that mean? It means taking the time to slow down and understand the life cycles of the community that's around us and to really plug in and empower those existing men and women that are in our community that may be sitting on a street corner, but God has equipped them to be a business leader. God's equipped them to be maybe the best barista in the country, but they weren't born with the tools and the life cycles that allowed them to get there. So how do we as the church be the church in our own community? And I loved Florence's presentation earlier, and she talked about partnering with the local churches in African communities. And that really hit me hard because we're no different. Like we have to partner with the churches in our own communities. We need to recognize that we ourselves need to tap into that place of saying, how can we affect the life cycles of our communities and not just look at how we can look to help outside, because both are needed.
And so our request is that you reach out to the millennials in your community. Our request is that you invite them to your table and you get to know them. And then you look outwards at your community and go, what problems exist that we can solve together? You have passion, I have wisdom. How do we remove the line between the two and use them to drive our mission forward, to live out what Christ has called us to? Thank you.
Thank you.